I am just pushing the recording button, so we should now be live and recorded, just so you know. And I'm grateful to see everybody today. I was hoping yesterday we had a beautiful spring day in Lakeville, Connecticut. I know some of you are not in Connecticut and warmer places, but today we're back to 45 and kind of raw. So we'll see. We'll see what the next week brings, but nice to see everybody. I'm going to launch right in today. We're going to talk quite a bit about the 1990s in Russia. That's the part of the book we read last night. And I think this is a really crucial period of time to understand where Vladimir Putin comes from. So we're going to dive right into that. I'm afraid that today at 2:45, I have to call it quits. I have an appointment at 3 o'clock that I have to go to, and I've got to get there. So I'm sorry that today's class is going to be about 45 minutes long instead of an hour, but I promise that we'll be back to the full hour starting next week. So I'm going to launch us right off today with a brief report. Most of all of us lived through the experience of the breakup of the Soviet Union, and in some ways it happened much more quietly, I think, than most people would have expected. The first time I went to the Soviet Union in 1983, it was impossible to imagine that there would be no Soviet Union 8 years later. That would have been an absurd thing to say out loud. And even 2 years earlier, I was in Moscow in the summer of 1989 and also the summer of 1990, and I was in Leningrad in the summer of 1991. It still didn't seem like the Soviet Union was going to come apart exactly. It wasn't clear. It was clear that lots of things were changing during the time of Mikhail Gorbachev, but this idea that the 15 Soviet republics would disband and that the Soviet Union, one of the great superpowers of the world, would simply cease to exist was something I think nobody really could articulate. It happened, the real breakdown happened in August of 1991. We're going to watch a brief video, about 4 minutes long, of what happened in that August period, that August coup. So let's take a look at it, and then I would be welcome any questions or any comments as when we come back. So if you'll give me just one moment to get this queued up. And give me just a second, we'll have it fully on board. Here we go.
It's August 4th, 1991. The USSR's first and last president, Mikhail Gorbachev, flies to his dacha in Crimea to rest after a flurry of diplomatic trips. After 6 years of Gorbachev's liberalizing reforms, the Soviet Union is falling apart. Every single republic has declared its independence or sovereignty, including Russia. There, Boris Yeltsin is in power and determined to bring the country out from under the rule of the Communist Party, which he had abandoned the previous year. Gorbachev, on the other hand, wants to keep the USSR from disintegrating by transforming it into the Union of Sovereign States, a federation in which each republic would enjoy broad autonomy. Moldova, Georgia, Armenia, and the 3 Baltic republics refused to participate in this new political project. The treaty that would replace the USSR with this new, smaller union is set to be signed on August 20th, 1991. A group of hardline Soviet officials that would come to be known as the Gang of Eight decides to put a stop to it and keep the USSR alive by force. The group includes Soviet Vice President Gennady Yanayev, KGB Chief Vladimir Khrushchev, Defense Minister Dmitry Yazov, and 5 others. On August 18, 1991, some group of 8 plotters and allies from the KGB, the Communist Party, and the military arrive at Gorbachev's dacha in Crimea. Gorbachev is given an ultimatum: declare a state of emergency, return to Moscow with the plotters and restore order in the country, or hand over power to the vice president, Yanayev. Gorbachev refuses. He remains at his dacha, guarded by the KGB. His lines of communication with the outside world are cut. On the morning of August 19th, the coup plotters roll thousands of troops and hundreds of tanks into Moscow. Soviet radio and TV announce that a state committee on the state of emergency, consisting of the Gang of Eight, has been created, and that Gorbachev's duties will be taken over by Yanayev due to illness. At the same time, a detachment of KGB special forces arrives at Yeltsin's own dacha outside Moscow. Thousands of people take to the streets of the Soviet capital and other cities to protest against the coup. The army does not disperse the protesters. Despite the troops dispatched to Yeltsin's location, he is allowed to leave. He arrives at Moscow's White House, then Russia's Parliament building, around noon on August 19th. In what would become an iconic image, Yeltsin stands on one of the tanks deployed in support of the putsch and speaks to the crowd, denouncing the takeover as a reactionary, unconstitutional coup. The Gang of Eight declares a state of emergency in Moscow and holds its first and only press conference at 5 p.m. on August 19th, telling journalists that Gorbachev is in Crimea for relaxation and treatment. Hundreds of thousands of protesters fill the streets of Moscow, Leningrad, and other major cities, showing that the plotters' plans are already falling apart. Yeltsin says he believes the military will not use force against the people. The situation remains tense on August 20th. The Gang of Eight declares an 11 p.m. curfew in Moscow. A mechanized division with orders to enforce it moves towards the White House. Civilians swarm the armored column, trying to stop its advance. 3 members of the crowd trying to defend the White House are killed in the early hours of August 21st. Gorbachev later recognizes them as posthumous heroes of the Soviet Union. With the plotters condemned by world leaders and unwilling to break up the protests by force, the first deaths bring the short-lived coup to an end. On the morning of August 21st, Defense Minister Dmitry Yazov declares that he is quitting the emergency committee and withdrawing troops from Moscow. On August 22nd, Gorbachev returns to the capital, where Yeltsin has banned the operations of the Communist Party, which had ruled the country for 74 years. With the coup leaders arrested, the USSR is as good as dead. Ukraine declares its independence on August 24th, Belarus on the 25th. The Soviet Union officially dissolves 4 months later, putting 15 independent countries on the map. Despite Yeltsin's opposition, the coup leaders were amnestied by Russia's parliament in 1994.
So let me stop there for a moment and see if anybody, I'd love to hear any questions, any comments. You can just unmute yourself and speak, or if you prefer to put the little hand up, I'm happy to call on you. Go ahead, John.
Well, it was confusing for me in the book. It was like the Keystone Cops, that whole decade, and this helped somewhat. But I've learned that I don't process Russian names very well, and they don't stay with me, and so they're all kind of alike. And it's just a struggle that I have when I read books about Russia. They don't compute well in my head, and I don't. And they're not like Fred and George and Keith. I can't. They don't stay there. But it was just such a mess. That's all.
Yeah. I think one of the most striking things to see, as I say, I was in the Soviet Union in 1989, 1990, and 1991. In each case, for at least a month. In 91, I was there for about 6 weeks, and the economic situation in the Soviet Union was really becoming untenable. The absence of goods in the markets, there were all kinds of forces at play, some of them quite nefarious, that were preventing food supplies from getting to the major cities. Inflation was skyrocketing. We're going to take a look at an inflation chart in just a minute, but the prices of things were really quite odd. I mean, in every conceivable respect. I'll give you this example. The official exchange rate in 1991, when I arrived in Leningrad in late June, I was getting 31 rubles to the dollar officially. That I had to declare how much money I was bringing into the country. Maybe I didn't declare all of it. Don't turn me in, please. But in order, the Soviets very much wanted my dollars. They wanted me to exchange money and get rubles so that they could have hard currency. The unofficial rate the black market rate for dollars at that point was closer to $600 to $800 rubles per dollar. So instead of trading it officially for 31 rubles to the dollar, I could trade it unofficially for 600, 700, 800 rubles to the dollar. That meant that the American dollar, any foreign currency, but particularly the American dollar, was absolute king there. There was a period of time in 1991 where if you stood on the corner, really anywhere in the city of Leningrad, now St. Petersburg again, you, with a $5 bill in your hand, somebody would come pick you up. Somebody would cross 3 lanes of traffic to slide over and pick you up for that $5. And the people who picked you up were doctors and lawyers and professors, and anybody with a car was very excited to make some money. In turn, they could turn that $5 into, do the math, 3,000, 4,000 rubles, which was really pretty extraordinary for them at the time. I remember going out to dinner to a Russian restaurant. This was a time in 1991 where there were a lot of cooperative joint venture restaurants opening up, particularly with German companies, Finnish companies. They were starting to open up businesses where you could pay for things in dollars. Those were quite expensive. If you went out to one of those restaurants, you would pay quite a bit of money on your credit card, whatever. They had started to take credit cards inside the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, my friend and I went to a Russian restaurant that still existed. They were often right next door. They had not been renovated in the same way, but they were perfectly good restaurants, really quite good restaurants. He and I went, we had salad, we had soup, we had meal, we had dessert, we had everything you could have. And at the end of the meal, being a Russian, he said, "I'm going to pay." And I said, "You're really not going to pay, because this whole meal is going to cost me the equivalent of 45 cents for the two of us." That's how much I was paying. And it's just a remarkably, the economy was so out of whack, depending on whether you were using dollars or rubles. I think probably not dissimilar from what we'll see in the next few months and years right now. Something was deeply wrong. They were not able to function on a normal, regular basis as an economy. And the coup in August really is a reflection, I think, of that great instability and that great inequity that was happening all across the country. By the time, what I appreciated in that video is we see that on August 24th, so almost immediately after the coup, Ukraine declares its independence. Interesting to note also from that video that Gorbachev, when he went to his retreat as the leader of the Soviet Union, his retreat was in Crimea, which has been, of course, a place of great dispute between Russia and Ukraine over the course of the independence of Ukraine. Crimea is the territory that Russia took back over in 2014. And of course, now we're seeing this war in Ukraine over who controls, especially the area around Crimea. So this is a very sensitive spot for Russia. Crimea, even at that time, was considered that place in Crimea was sort of like Camp David is to the U.S. president, somewhere to get away from Moscow, to get away from it all and relax a little bit for a few days. Let me again stop there and just see if we have any questions.
Yeah, Keith,
Yeah.
I'm not sure how I hold my hand up.
Well, go ahead, please.
Okay,
Go ahead.
my wife and I were living in Moscow at the time of all this. And my impression was that the unfolding events were surreal. And I always had the feeling that at some point in my lifetime, it will come out that this was theater. Even including the fact that the 3 killed were the 3 representatives of the 3 major religions of the Soviet Union. It was done with that detail. Second, although we made the same observations you did about taxis, we found that waving a carton of Marlboros was better because it attracted more attention. And naively, I thought, well, there must be a lot of smokers here. But in fact, no one ever smoked them. They were currency. So they were always traded. And I thought the one guy who got stuck at the end with Marlboros has a garage full of Marlboros. The other thing that occurred at the time, and I think it's covered in Masha Green's book, there was a rumor that the gang of 8 had accumulated foodstuffs, liquor, other things, so that they could release that upon the success of the coup. And therefore, everyone would see, yep, this has been a good thing. We're now able to get things. And that fund of goods was under the command of one person in Leningrad, and that person was Putin. So he ended, if that's true, he ended up a very wealthy man.
Yeah, I'm skeptical of that last part, just because understanding his history, I don't think he was yet as connected to that as it would have been. But David Remnick, in his wonderful book Lenin's Tomb, writes a lot about both the stockpiling of food. I think exactly what you're describing, people holding on, these powerful oligarchic forces, even within the Soviet Union, holding on to food and stockpiling it in order to release it at some generous time. But he also talks quite a bit about the just gross inefficiencies of the system. Here was a command economy being run out of Moscow, and nobody was really moving, doing anything until given the order to do whatever it was they were supposed to do. So he describes, I can remember a chapter in which he describes fish simply rotting on a dock because they had not gotten the official order to start shipping the fish to wherever they needed to go. So I think it's not unlike, on the one hand, I think there are all these kind of conspiracy ideas out there of how all this activity had been planned out and created on purpose. On the other hand, I think we're also looking at considerable ineptitude and inefficiency in a system that, quite frankly, wasn't a very good market system to begin with. Go ahead, please, Meg.
It's Tim. Go ahead, Sarah. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
It's actually Meg's husband, Tim.
Okay,
But
fine.
Keith, when did the Soviets start thinking about what they were going to do with their nuclear weapons? And, I understand they moved most of them from the other republics back to Russia, but how quickly did that happen? And what was the American involvement in that?
This was something, if you remember, if you go back to, in particular, for example, the Bush versus Clinton campaign of 1992, this was a hot topic. What to do about the proliferation of nuclear weapons in the aftermath of the demise of the Soviet Union. There were great plans afoot to get, and I think successful ones, to get all the nuclear weapons out of places like Kazakhstan and any of the other republics. I would imagine they also had nuclear weapons in Ukraine, to bring them back into Russia proper. The United States, as far as I know, this is not something I've read about recently, so I'm not 100% sure that my answer is going to be very satisfying, but I think the United States was doing everything that it could to help the Yeltsin government bring those nuclear weapons back to Russia. They didn't want nuclear weapons in Armenia. They didn't want nuclear weapons in Kazakhstan, for example. Right. This just seemed like a really dangerous situation. And at that point, the United States was certainly backing Boris Yeltsin as the natural heir apparent, the logical democratic heir apparent for this country. As it turned out, Yeltsin was nowhere near as successful as the president as the United States and the rest of the world would have liked. I think he's got a lot to answer for in history, but at the time, certainly in 1991, he's coming off the glow of this, as the video said, this iconic moment of standing on the tank, of rejecting the Soviet Union. He really was the hero of the time. Whether that lasted, I think by the end of this class, I'm going to show one more video, and we'll see that Yeltsin had made himself something of a buffoon by the end of it. Let me show you a couple of just some statistics that I think are worth looking at. These, when we talk about what was happening in Russia in the 1990s, I think it's important to recognize that economically speaking, and I hope everybody can see that okay, the chart is a little bit light, but if we're using zero here on this chart as 0% growth. This is an annual percentage GDP growth of the Russian Federation. So this chart is actually beginning before the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1990. Already we see that the GDP was in decline in 1990 to 91, this period of perestroika and glasnost under Gorbachev. They were not seeing growth. In fact, it was negative. The numbers were negative and quite negative, actually. If we look at that, a 5% decline in GDP is enormous. And then if we look at the next year, a 15% decline, it comes up to only an 8% decline the year after that. These are terrible numbers. This is a real catastrophe here between 1990 and 1998. We see a little glimmer of hope in 97 with 1.4% growth year to year. But then in 1998, there was a devaluation of the ruble. The Russians defaulted on some debts, and they sunk right back down 5.3%. What's really interesting to look at here, though, are these crucial years, these Putin years, really. He doesn't come along in 1998, but after the devaluation of the ruble, there was quite a lot of room to move up. 99 was a good year. 2000 was a good year. Now Putin is in power. And over the course of the next few years, until we get to the financial crisis of 2008, Russia is growing and growing really at pretty high, difficult to sustain, but high rates, rates that we saw in places like China over a similar period. So we're talking 10%, 5%, 7%, 8.5%. These are really good numbers. I think as we move forward, it's worth thinking about in a kind of condensed way. If we think about our own American history, that the 1990s for Russia was really very much like the 1930s for the United States. This was a depression. This was a really serious economic crisis of enormous stakes, everything. They're trying to transform themselves from a complete command economy run by centralized economic departments, trying to turn it into a market economy. This was a pipe dream from the beginning. This wasn't really going to work the way they imagined that it would. There were a number of early attempts at talking about these 500-day plans and these shock economy plans that would turn the Soviet system into a European market economy within a year and a half. That just didn't happen. And people, everyone really lost their savings, with the exception of some people, and we'll talk about them in just a minute, this oligarchic class that starts to pile up a lot of wealth and a lot of resources as they went along. I want to show you just a couple more charts, and then I would love to, if anybody has some comments, I would love to hear them. Give me just one moment. I want to show you some inflation numbers. You know, we've been talking a lot, of course, this year about inflation in the United States. Inflation is hovering anywhere between sort of the 6 and 8% level, and we see that as a really quite critical circumstance. I just want to show you what the Russians were facing in the aftermath of the Soviet Union. So here is a chart that begins. We'll take this very far left side to represent the waning years of the Soviet Union. This, I'm sorry that it's not better marked, but probably sometime in the early 90s. But then we see this jump in over the course of about 3 years in the mid to late 90s. Inflation was running well over 100% in some of those years. There were days, there was a famous day in Russia where prices jumped 25% in one 24-hour period. This was a really massive inflation problem. In fact, even in its best years, and we can go into a little bit more detail if I bring this down to a year long, even in its not so bad years, we're still talking about 6 to 9% inflation over the course most of the time. So, what we get so used to in this country, Fed targets of 2% inflation and things like that, we've gotten really quite spoiled, I think, to the idea that anything above 4% is catastrophic. In Russia, we were talking about hundreds of percent per year of inflation. So let me pause there just for a minute and ask if there's any reaction to those two statements. Oh, one last thing. I'm sorry. I mentioned the 1930s for Russia as a period of time of similar to our Great Depression. I would call the 2000s, the first term Putin years, more like our 1950s, a period of really highly accelerated growth, a sense that they had climbed out of a long period of decline and trouble, and now all things were possible. And I think that more than anything is really where Putin gets a lot of his popularity, is he was seen as somebody who managed to pull the country out of this bad period. So let me pause there and see if there are any comments or questions.
Is there I think the book did speak to this, but why didn't this change over from one kind of economy to another? Why didn't it work?
I think, I remember being in Russia. This was after the breakup of the Soviet Union. So I was in Russia and I was talking to a friend of mine who worked in a factory. He was not working. He was not making shoes, but he was working for the shoemaking factory in sort of the business end of things. And they were shares were being distributed of these companies. This change over to a market system meant that they were trying to, for example, list his company on some sort of stock market, some nascent stock market. Nobody had any idea what that meant. This was a country where for 75 years, that kind of capitalist market simply didn't exist. And the idea of buying shares in something and owning something that you didn't tangibly have was just, it seemed like magic or something. And I remember having this conversation, just trying to express how shares work. How does the New York Stock Exchange work, for example, with somebody who was a very bright man and a very an educated man. It was like I was speaking Japanese to him or something like that. It just was not a feature of life that he really understood. And meanwhile, there were people out there who were buying up these shares, the people who did have an understanding of how this worked. And they would give these relatively worthless rubles, and rubles that were losing value rapidly because of inflation. They would pay, I'll give you 50 rubles for those 18 shares you have in your hand. And you can't buy bread with the 18 shares, but you can buy bread with the 50 rubles. So they were making that kind of trade. And so people who knew what they were doing were gobbling up lots and lots of shares of companies quickly. This is where we get at the same time, and this is to come back to the earlier comment, people who are already in positions of power, people who were running under the Soviet system, who were running companies or running whole industries, were gobbling up these companies very quickly, buying up shares when quite ignorant people, no fault of their own, they just didn't know how the system worked, were handing over shares for money. Pennies on the dollar, really. This was outrageous, kind of hard shark mentality of an economy, and they just simply didn't understand, I think, how it all worked. I was in the city of Novosibirsk in 1994. Novosibirsk is Russia's third largest city. Moscow, St. Petersburg are 1 and 2, and then Novosibirsk is a major industrial city. It's also a major hub for places, gas and oil, natural gas and oil. A lot of companies have their headquarters out there. In a way, it's kind of like a Dallas, if you will, in Russia. and or Houston, and they had at one point they were reporting 85% unemployment in the factories, and not 85% overall, but 85% unemployment in the factories. People were out of work everywhere. I don't know what the official unemployment rates were in Russia in the 1990s, but I suspect they were across the country, probably somewhere in the 20 to 30% range, which are just enormous numbers. That's like the Great Depression in the United States, just fantastically bad numbers. I don't know if I know we've got a couple of people on the call who were in Russia in the 1990s and would love to hear if you have some comments or thoughts on that.
I have a question.
Sure, please.
The book on Putin says that it wasn't just private citizens who were completely ignorant of the system of democracy, but also people involved with the government, which is kind of shocking to me that no one had been sent to Harvard Business School or whatever, the London School of Economics or something, for some training for the new democracy. Then the second question I had was in a documentary I've been watching this week called Citizen K on Amazon, which is about Kharkovsky. They claim that Putin was actually, when he was assistant mayor of St. Petersburg, that he was pocketing money the way kind of African dictators do, that was sent for famine relief to the city. Is that true?
Well, I think so. Maybe if I could take those one at a time. The first question, I think, again, I don't think anybody anticipated just how quickly the whole system would deconstruct. I think the idea was, I spent the summer of 1991 in Leningrad, and I left Russia on August 15th. The coup broke out on August 19th. I have to say that I and the people that I was staying with, and I was staying with a Russian family, would not have predicted that that was going to happen. So I think there was just very little lead time to really figure out what to do next. If the whole system breaks down overnight, what do you do next? And certainly the Soviets leading up to 1991 were reluctant to turn to the West for help. While Gorbachev was doing more of that, but certainly up until Gorbachev came along, the idea that they would ask for advice or help from the West was antithetical to what they were all about. So that was difficult. And then I think the few people that were really studying this got it wrong. I think that the tricky part to economies of this size and scale, especially because the economy of the Soviet Union was based on an understanding that there were 15 republics and almost 300 million people working and living in that economy. Suddenly there are 15 countries. They are independent of one another. The Latvians, the Lithuanians, and the Estonians didn't trust the Russians at all, didn't want to help them in this particular situation. And yet a year before they were intertwined with each other, and that made it, I think, ultimately a tough knot to unwind. As for your second question, I think what we read in the book is that Putin was certainly in a position to do the things that you described. I think there is still there's a front page article in today's New York Times about Putin's wealth and how do you figure his wealth, because his wealth is so tied up in what the country itself owns. And how do you separate these two things? And I think he's been really good at this since the 1990s. He was certainly in a position of great influence as the deputy mayor of St. Petersburg in terms of construction projects, in terms of all sorts of things. And he bought, at the very least, a lot of loyalty from others, even if he himself, there's some question about whether he himself became rich. Everybody he knew growing up and working at the KGB with him when he was younger, they all got rich. So I suspect he figured out lots of systems to make sure that he would always live well. It didn't, if we read this, as I read this book, I don't get the sense that this was his main driving interest. He became more and more consumed by the idea of power. There was I don't know if it was Thomas Friedman, somebody I was reading in the last 2 weeks wrote an essay about power versus wealth in Russia. And basically, if you have to ask the question, what's more important, power or wealth, then you don't understand Russia. And the bottom line was suggesting that it's all about power and that wealth comes along as a byproduct of power. That's an interesting way of thinking about it. Natalia, you've had your hand up.
Yes, hi. I just want to make a comment or a couple of comments about the shares. So guys, think about, so it was a Soviet system, so the state owned everything. So people did not have any ownership of anything. So now we suddenly market economy. So how do we divide all this wealth and give it to citizens? So what the people basically did, they calculated whatever number of GDP and they divided it by population. And so that would be your shares. That's what Keith was talking about. So for example, I would get my 10 shares of something. And now what do I do with it? So people didn't understand, as Keith said, but the people who were, for example, I'm a director of that factory. So now I kind of probably say, okay, why don't I just collect all these shares? And that's how initially those oligarch or rich people start to emerge, because they were just able now to all these workers, 1,000 workers in my factory, they all want to have bread. But these shares, what do they do with it? They didn't understand. So by giving them money and accumulating shares, now I have ownership of that factory. So that's the first stage of being rich. But then in the 96, or whenever Yeltsin was running for re-election, then there was another scheme, which is called loans for shares. So there, when Yeltsin was fundraising for his campaign, he was getting money, but he was promising now shares of the other bigger things. And that's how actual oligarchs developed from there. Okay, so that's one thing. So, and also, so institutions were one thing that we didn't know, like there was no law, like it was really like Wild West, because we didn't understand how market economy works. So who is checking balances? That was not familiar. Okay, so now was a comment about education. So during the 90s, there was no opportunity to leave the Soviet Union to do any education and any Harvard or anything. So it was kind of, again, there was no knowledge of that. But then after the breakup, of course, people went to Harvard, and now they're also they're in the position of, universities, they are really bringing back the knowledge, and now it's kind of that a little bit. And
Natalia, I'm going to step in here. I appreciate everything you're saying, and I'm glad to have those examples. I'm cognizant of the time, and I have to close out at 2:45 today. And I want to show just a couple more things, because there's another element to all this that we need to talk about and need to recognize, and that is whatever else was true in the 1990s, there was a serious criminal element that was also emerging in Russia. The Russian mafia is something that I think we all recognize. That phrase was really blossoming here in the 1990s. In the absence, as Natalia was saying, in the absence of any rules, it was like the Wild West. There were people being gunned down in streets. There were real straight up mafia conflicts that were happening. We see that by the time we get to 1994, the homicide rate in Russia per 100,000 people was 32.6. In the major cities of St. Petersburg and Moscow, the percentage was much higher than that. Just to give you some context, the American homicide rate, which is a pretty relatively high one for a Western industrialized country, is something like 5.9% right now. So 32.6 is about 5 or 6 times that number. And in the cities, it was higher still, because this takes into account the entire population. So this crime element was serious and very problematic. I remember being in Russia a couple of times in 1993 and 1994, and recognizing that, boy, there were a lot of guns on the street. Boy, there were a lot of bodyguards looming around. If you came around the wrong corner too fast, you'd run into people with lots of armored gear and weapons. It was scary. And I remember also towards the end of the decade in 1998 or 99, being in Russia and thinking, I'm not coming back here for a little while. This has gone a little too far, and it's gotten a little too scary. So the other thing that Putin managed to do, if I go back to that screen just for a minute, the other thing he managed to do, we see these are still pretty bad numbers, but this 29.1, the second peak, in the time that Putin has been president or leader of the country, it has come way down. And he has, at least in terms of this mafia control of the country, he has contained crime in a way that I think everybody recognizes. Perhaps he's done it in sometimes quite brutal ways, but I think if you live in Russia, I think you're grateful. Most Russians have been grateful for this more reasonable level of crime than what was happening in the 1990s. It did indeed feel lawless in the 1990s and was rather scary. I want to show one more map, and this is what we're going to focus our attention on next week. And again, I apologize, I've got to go in just a couple of minutes, but I want to show you what's happening on the international level with Russia in the 1990s. And this is really particularly germane, I think, to what we're seeing right now in Ukraine. And we've got to talk about this, I think, as we understand Putin, understand ultimately what he was trying to do. In this particular map, the darkest colored parts of the map, England, France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Norway, Portugal, Italy, these are the original NATO countries of 1949. So this is, if think about 1949, Eastern Europe was controlled by the Soviet Union, places like Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia. These were all countries that were ultimately part of the Warsaw Pact, which was basically the Eastern Bloc's version of NATO, a defensive alliance to protect against incursion. NATO began to expand a little bit in 1952. So the by the way, not on this map are Canada and the United States. They are critical members of NATO, but this is just simply showing Europe. In 1952, the expansion of NATO into Greece and Turkey, that was a big deal. Turkey sitting at the southern end of the Black Sea. The Turks and the Russians have been fighting over territory for the better part of 400 years. And so this was a major addition to NATO when Turkey joined in 1952. Germany, of course, at this point was split between West Germany and East Germany, but having the Germans join was another major moment in NATO. Spain joined, and then look at what happens in the 1990s and into the 2000s. We see a giant proliferation of countries here in NATO. This is what Putin has been talking about so much when he talks about Ukraine. Ukraine right here, just to the east and north of places that joined NATO just within the last 20 years. Some of these, we look at, for example, the countries that joined in 2004, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, these were actually parts of the Soviet Union. So when it broke up in 1991, those were all republics within the Soviet Union, and now they're members of NATO. This is what, when Putin talks about the encroachment and the encirclement and all the language that he uses to talk about being concerned about the safety of Russia, this is the map that he looks at. It's getting closer and closer and closer. I think I'll leave it there. We can pick that up next week, but I just wanted to give you a sense of what was happening inside Russia, both politically, economically, in terms of crime, but also in terms of foreign policy. I do apologize that I have to run early today, but as always, I really love seeing all these faces, and we'll see you next week when the sun will be out and shiny. Bye, everybody.